Margaret Keene is no longer permitted to make operational decisions for this company. Julian Reed said it into a microphone while 200 donors, employees, yacht owners, and city officials watched me from white-clothed tables. Behind him, a 20-foot screen showed grainy security footage of a woman in my navy coat, walking away from a fuel manifold moments before a customer's yacht lost pressure and flooded its engine room. A red circle had been placed around her head, as though I were a suspect on the evening news. Julian turned toward me with the careful sadness people use around the very old. "For everyone's safety," he continued, "we have asked Maggie to step back before someone gets hurt." My niece Allison stood beside him, holding a silver tray. On it lay a severance agreement and an empty space waiting for my security badge. I could have crossed the room and torn the microphone from his hand. Instead, I unclipped the badge from my jacket and placed it gently on the tray. Then I looked past Julian and studied the black water visible in the video behind him. The timestamp said 9:15 p.m. The tide said Julian was lying. Before I tell you how one false video nearly cost 48 people their livelihoods, let me know where you're listening from. And if someone you trusted ever mistook your silence for weakness, stay with me. Some lies look solid until you know exactly where to measure. My name is Margaret Keene, though everyone in Annapolis called me Maggie. I was 71 that night, and for most of my life I had worked as a marine surveyor, the person owners, insurers, and courts called when they needed to know why a vessel failed and who was responsible. I founded Keene Harbor Works with my younger sister Caroline in 1982. Back then, we had one splintered pier, a borrowed forklift, and a repair shed whose roof leaked harder than the boats inside it. Caroline handled customers and payroll. I crawled through engine compartments, tested hull plating, inspected welds, and learned to read damage the way some people read handwriting. Steel remembers pressure, fiberglass remembers impact. Water leaves a record, even after everyone involved has agreed to lie. By the year of the gala, our yard stretched across 11 waterfront acres. We employed welders, mechanics, painters, riggers, and electricians. We repaired racing sailboats, workboats, and polished yachts whose owners rarely learned the names of the people keeping them afloat. The yard was not merely property to me. It was the life Caroline and I had built before cancer reduced her world to a hospital room and one final request. "Don't let Allison feel alone," she told me. Allison was 19 when her mother died. I took her into my home, paid for college, and eventually gave her a place in the company. She was bright, careful with numbers, and terrified of disappointing people. That last quality worried me long before Julian learned how to use it. He entered our lives 6 years before the gala. Julian wore tailored jackets to dock meetings and spoke about unlocking waterfront value without getting grease beneath his nails. He advised marinas facing rising insurance costs and redevelopment pressure. At first I liked him. The dangerous ones do not arrive wearing warning signs. Julian listened more than he spoke, brought Allison coffee during late audits, and once spent 2 nights coordinating repairs after a winter storm. 3 years after marrying Allison, he became our outside strategy consultant. A year later, he was sitting in board meetings. The Harbor Lights Gala was his idea. It would fund paid apprenticeships for local graduates. I agreed because the trades had given me everything, and I wanted the yard to outlive me. The ballroom occupied an old sail loft overlooking Spa Creek. Beyond the windows, masts shifted in darkness. Our oldest tug, the Caroline K, sat illuminated at the main pier with my sister's name across her stern. I was scheduled to announce the apprenticeship fund at 8:30. At 8:22, Julian asked the audiovisual technician to dim the room. He did not tell me why. The first video showed the flooded engine room of the Celestine, a 60-foot yacht we had serviced 11 days earlier. Its port engine had seized after a cooling line separated under pressure. Then Julian showed the security footage. The woman in my coat entered the service bay. Her face was hidden by a hood. She bent near the manifold cabinet for 37 seconds and walked away. Julian let the silence build before telling the room that my credential had opened the bay that evening. I remember Allison looking at me then, not with anger, with fear. "That hurt worse, Maggie," she said. "Please don't make this harder." She approached while people I had hired avoided my eyes. Tomas Alvarez, my foreman of 31 years, studied his folded hands. Harper, Allison's 20-year-old daughter, stood near the back wall, fighting tears. I placed my badge on the tray. "Is this what you want?" I asked Allison, her fingers tightened around its edge. "It's temporary," she whispered, "until the insurer finishes reviewing everything." Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice so nearby tables could hear. "You've carried this place long enough, Maggie. Let us protect you from yourself." There it was. Not an accusation, a kindness sharpened into a weapon. I nodded as though he had done me a favor and returned to my chair. Julian resumed the program. Glasses clinked, nervous applause moved through the room. I watched the frozen frame, still displayed on a side monitor. The camera faced east across the service dock. A white measurement stripe was painted on the seawall behind the woman in my coat. I had installed it years earlier so our crews could estimate water height during storm surges. At 9:15 that evening, the tide should have been falling and more than 2 feet below the third stripe. In Julian's video, the water touched the fifth. The reflected light also came from the wrong direction. That footage had not been recorded at night. It had been recorded shortly after sunrise. Someone had changed the timestamp, worn my coat, and used my badge. But as I stared at that impossible tide, another realization settled over me. Julian had not created such an elaborate lie merely to make an old woman retire. He needed me removed before I noticed something much larger. I left the gala before Julian finished thanking the sponsors. No one tried to stop me. That was the part I remembered most clearly. Not the accusation or the red circle around the woman in my coat, but the way people who had known me for decades suddenly found reasons to study their napkins. Outside, the night air carried salt, diesel, and wet rope. The Caroline K tugged against her lines beneath the floodlights. Caroline's name shone across the stern in gold leaf, steady even as the boat moved. I stood there longer than I should have. When my sister was dying, she had not asked me to preserve the company. She had asked me to protect her daughter. At 19, Allison had been all sharp elbows and frightened eyes. She sat beside Caroline's hospital bed with a notebook on her lap, writing down medication times, because numbers gave her something she could control. After the funeral, she moved into my house without ever calling it home. I paid her tuition at the University of Maryland, but I made her work summers in the yard. Not in the air-conditioned office. She started in receiving, checking packing slips against shipments, while Tomas taught her that a missing washer could delay an entire launch. She hated the grease and the shouting, but she learned. By 28, Allison could find a payroll discrepancy faster than most accountants I had hired. She understood financing, vendor terms, and the quiet terror of a company that looked profitable while running out of cash. I made her chief financial officer at 35. People assumed I did it because she was family. They were partly right. The mistake was not giving her responsibility. The mistake was rescuing her whenever that responsibility became painful. When a vendor threatened suit over a contract she had misunderstood, I negotiated it away. When she approved a bad software system, I covered the loss from my personal account. Each time, I told myself I was protecting Caroline's child. What I taught Allison was that consequences belong to someone stronger. Julian understood that weakness almost immediately. He met her at a waterfront development conference in Baltimore. He was presenting a case study about old marinas surviving rising insurance premiums and aggressive land buyers. According to Allison, he spent half their first conversation asking about her work and none of it talking about himself. That impressed her. It impressed me too. Julian did not arrive at Keene Harbor Works demanding authority. He offered solutions. When a storm damaged our electrical pedestals, he negotiated a temporary rate with a contractor he knew. When a neighboring marina sold to a condominium developer, he warned us that waterfront assessments were changing. When our insurer questioned 2 storage buildings, Julian helped Allison prepare a capital plan that kept our policy active. He remembered employees' names and sent Harper a book on naval architecture when she mentioned studying engineering. For nearly 4 years, Julian behaved like a man grateful to be welcomed into something larger than himself. The first time I saw the other side of him was small enough to dismiss. During a budget meeting, Allison questioned a consulting fee he had approved. Julian smiled, touched the back of her chair, and said, "That's why I handle the complicated negotiations, sweetheart." The room went quiet. Allison laughed too quickly. Later I told her I did not like the way he had spoken to her. "He was joking," she said. "He was correcting you in front of your employees. He saved us $80,000 on that contract." She was not defending the joke. She was presenting an invoice for why she had to accept it. That pattern repeated. Every time Julian crossed a boundary, he attached the offense to something useful he had done. He began attending insurance calls because Allison found the terminology intimidating. Then he started leading them. He took over vendor negotiations because he claimed our suppliers respected a harder voice. He requested copies of board minutes in case Allison needed support. By the time I noticed how much information passed through him, everyone else considered it efficient. 3 months before the gala, Julian brought us the first warning. He entered my office with Allison and closed the door. Our insurer, Atlantic Mutual Marine, had flagged an increase in claims connected to vessels recently serviced at our yard. None had caused injuries, but the pattern concerned the underwriters. "A cooling line separation, an electrical short, and now a steering fault," Julian said, placing a folder on my desk. 3 incidents in 11 weeks. I signed off on 2 of those vessels. "I know," he said it gently. That was his talent. Julian could place a knife on the table and make you feel rude for noticing it. Allison opened the folder. "They're asking for an operational review. Then give them one." "It may not be that simple," Julian said. "They specifically asked whether succession planning has affected quality control." I looked at Allison. She lowered her eyes. "What did you tell them?" "That the company is stable," Julian answered. "That you remain fully capable, but we should be realistic about how they'll interpret another claim." It was plausible. Insurers needed uncertainty, not proof of incompetence, to raise premiums. Julian proposed temporary safeguards, dual signatures on surveys, restricted access to certain systems, and a review of my recent inspections. I refused the restrictions, but allowed the review. That was the first door I opened for him. After the gala, I drove home without turning on the radio. My house sat on a narrow creek south of town, close enough to hear halyards knocking against masts at night. I did not sleep. At 4 a.m, I opened the board packet Julian had distributed before the event. Most of it contained financial summaries and insurance correspondence. Near the back, I found a document titled Celestine Final Inspection Acknowledgement. The last page carried my signature. It certified that I had personally inspected the cooling assembly at 6:40 p.m. On the night of the alleged footage. I stared at the name written in blue ink, Margaret E. Keene. The shape was convincing, the date was correct, but I had never signed that document. And at 6:40 that evening, I had been 40 miles away, sitting beside Harper in a hospital waiting room. The hospital had records. Harper had been admitted at 5:12 that afternoon after collapsing during a lab. Severe abdominal pain, dehydration, and a fever high enough to frighten Allison. The doctors suspected appendicitis, then ruled it out. I stayed beside Harper until nearly midnight while Allison drove home for clothes. There were nurses who had spoken to me, parking records, and a cafeteria receipt stamped 6:31 p.m. At 6:40, when the Celestine acknowledgement claimed I was signing paperwork at Keene Harbor Works, I had been buying soup I never ate. The forgery should have relieved me. It gave me an alibi. Instead, it proved the lie had been built long before Julian stood on that stage. At 7 the next morning, I drove to the yard. Fog hung above Spa Creek, softening the masts and warehouse roofs. The mechanics on the early shift were already moving boats. A travel lift groaned near the South Pier. Air tools rattled inside the service building. For 41 years, those sounds had meant the day was beginning. That morning, they sounded like work continuing after my funeral. I parked in my usual space beneath the sycamore tree. Someone had placed a white plastic sign over the metal plaque bearing my name. Visitor parking. I looked at it for several seconds. Then I parked anyway. The receptionist, Kayla, rose when I entered. "Ms. Keene," she said my name too carefully. "Morning, Kayla." Her eyes moved toward Julian's temporary office. "I was told to call Mr. Reed if you came in. You just did." I continued toward my office. The door was open. For years, the room had been crowded with survey reports, tide charts, old photographs, and failed brass fittings. The drafting table Caroline and I bought at a government auction still stood beneath the windows. Everything else was gone. My books had been packed into 6 cardboard boxes. The framed photograph of Caroline launching our first repaired workboat rested face down on top of one. My desk drawers had been emptied. A new lock had been installed on the filing cabinet. Julian appeared behind me. I hoped we could do this more gently. He wore a charcoal suit and no overcoat, as though cold air existed only for people without offices. You cleared my room before the board voted. The board authorized an immediate operational separation last night. There was no quorum. Allison and the employee trustee were present. The trustee left before your presentation. Julian folded his hands. This is why a pause is necessary. You are focused on procedure while our insurance coverage is at risk. Procedure decides who owns a company. It can also become an obsession when someone is under stress. He had already learned to place every challenge inside the same frame. If I objected, I was emotional. If I cited rules, I was fixated. If I stayed silent, he called it withdrawal. Who went through my files? I asked. A records team. Nothing was discarded. Where are my active survey binders? Secured by whom? People authorized to protect this business. His answer was polished enough to leave no surface to strike. Allison entered before I responded. She had not changed from the gala. Her dark dress was hidden beneath a wool coat, and shadows sat beneath her eyes. Aunt Maggie, please come upstairs. She had not called me Aunt Maggie in front of Julian for months. I followed her to the conference room, overlooking the haul-out basin. She closed the door. I know how this looks. It looks organized. The insurer demanded separation between you and current operations. Did the insurer order Julian to pack my photographs? Her mouth tightened. This is temporary. Temporary measures do not require new locks. She looked through the window. Below us, Tomas directed a crew positioning a trawler beneath the lift. He never looked up. Everyone is scared, Allison said. If Atlantic Mutual suspends us, the bank can freeze the credit line. We miss one payroll and people start leaving. So you handed Julian the yard. I handed him authority to stabilize it. You handed him my office, my files, and my name. Her head turned. What does that mean? I placed a photocopy of the Celestine acknowledgement on the table. Allison read it twice. You signed this. No, it looks exactly like your signature. That is the point of a forgery. She lowered herself into a chair. Where were you? With Harper at Anne Arundel Medical Center. A change crossed her face. She remembered. You came after I called. I stayed after you went home. Allison pressed her thumb against the paper. Julian said the system showed your credentials. Systems show what they are given. You think he forged this? I think someone did. She stood too quickly, pushing the chair backward. You cannot accuse my husband because you're angry. I have not accused him. You don't need to. I know that look. She had seen me use that look on dishonest suppliers and captains who believed charm could survive evidence. Allison held the paper toward me. Take this home. Do not show it to employees. Do not start a rumor we cannot contain. For one dangerous moment, I nearly told her about the tide. Instead, I folded the copy into my coat. Do not sign anything Julian puts in front of you, I said. Her expression closed. By noon, my company email had been disabled. My access to the accounting portal was gone. The maintenance database rejected my password. A notice instructed department heads that only Allison, Julian, or Tomas could approve work. My name remained above the building entrance. Inside, it no longer opened a single door. At 3:17, I was home documenting everything while it was fresh. I opened an old security application on my personal tablet. Years earlier, after several thefts, I had asked our vendor to send emergency access alerts to both the company server and my private device. Julian had changed my password. He had forgotten the alerts. A red notification sat at the top of the screen. Kranged MK001 used, 2:13 a.m. The date was the morning after the gala hours after I placed my badge on Allison's tray. I opened the location detail. My disabled credential had not been used at the front office or server room. It had opened Warehouse 4, where the Celestine's failed parts were being held for the insurance investigation. I stared at the alert until the screen dimmed. Warehouse 4 was not an ordinary storage building. It was where we isolated failed equipment connected to insurance claims, lawsuits, or possible manufacturer defects. Once an item entered that room, it was photographed, tagged, sealed, and recorded on a chain of custody sheet. No mechanic was supposed to touch it alone. No administrator was supposed to enter after hours. And no disabled security badge should have opened the door at 2:13 in the morning. I saved 3 screenshots and emailed them to an address Julian did not know I maintained. Then I printed the alert, wrote the date and time across the bottom, and placed it inside a locked drawer. My first instinct was to drive back to the yard and demand access. That would have been satisfying. It also would have been foolish. Julian had already framed me as an aging founder who could not accept losing control. If I appeared at Warehouse 4 before sunrise, angry and carrying accusations, he would call it proof of instability. So I waited. At 8:43, my phone rang. The caller identified himself as Franklin Moss, a field adjuster for Atlantic Mutual Marine. I had known him professionally for nearly 15 years. Franklin was careful, humorless, and incapable of pretending that social discomfort mattered more than documentation. "Ms. Keene," he said, "I'm conducting a physical examination of the Celestine components at 10:30. The company advised that you've been separated from operations. I've been suspended from making operational decisions." "That is not what I asked." "No," he paused. "Your name remains on the original survey, and the carrier considers you a material witness. You may attend as an observer. You may not handle evidence without my permission, I understand. Mr. Reed may object." Mr. Reed objects professionally. Franklin did not laugh, but his silence shortened. I arrived at the yard 10 minutes early. This time I parked in the visitor space. I wanted every camera to show restraint. Warehouse 4 stood behind the paint building, a low concrete structure with no windows and a steel door painted the same gray as the winter sky. Franklin waited outside beside a photographer and an independent mechanical engineer. Julian arrived with Allison. His expression changed when he saw me, but only for a fraction of a second. "Franklin," he said, "I thought we agreed Maggie's participation might compromise the review." Franklin opened his clipboard. "The carrier requested her presence. Why?" "Because her signature appears on the inspection acknowledgement." Allison looked at me. I gave her nothing. Julian adjusted one cuff. "Maggie is under considerable emotional strain." Franklin glanced toward the photographer. "Then we'll avoid emotional questions." He unlocked the door using a temporary code provided by Allison. The warehouse smelled of dust, machine oil, and cold concrete. Metal shelving divided the space into narrow aisles. Each shelf held labeled bins, sealed pumps, scorched cables, cracked propeller blades, and other expensive reminders that machines did not care about excuses. The Celestine evidence occupied a steel work table beneath 2 fluorescent lights. A transparent bag held the failed isolation valve from the yacht's raw water cooling system. According to Julian's presentation, I had inspected that valve before the vessel left our yard. Franklin photographed the seal before cutting it. "Mrs. Keene," the engineer said, "can you identify this component?" "Miss Keene," I corrected, "and I can identify what it is supposed to be." Franklin removed the valve and placed it on a clean pad. The body was yellow gold, small enough to fit between both hands. A fractured stem protruded from the top where the handle assembly had failed. Salt residue marked one side. "I did not touch it. I did not need to. That is not the valve I inspected," I said. Julian folded his arms. "You saw it installed in a cramped engine compartment 11 days ago. I also ordered it." The engineer leaned closer. "What difference are you seeing?" "The color." First, Julian exhaled through his nose. I kept my attention on the engineer. "The specified valve was silicon bronze. It has a darker red-brown cast. This body is ordinary yellow brass, likely with higher zinc content. Look at the machined edges near the flange. They're too bright. The casting is thinner around the stem housing." The engineer lifted a small magnet, then set it aside and examined the fracture through a magnifier. "Color alone isn't conclusive. No, the weight will be." Franklin placed the component on a digital scale. 2 pounds, 11 ounces. I looked at him. The valve I approved weighed 3 pounds. 6. Julian spoke quickly. "A supplier may have changed the design, not without changing the model number." Franklin rotated the body. A shallow stamp appeared beneath the salt residue, M4821B. I knew that number. It belonged to a discounted import line we had rejected 2 years earlier after one of the stems fractured during bench testing. Tomas had stood beside me when I ordered every unit returned. This model was never approved for installation at Keene Harbor Works, I said. Allison's face tightened. Could it have been an emergency substitution? It could have been, Julian answered before anyone asked him. The Celestine's owner moved the launch date forward. Procurement may have sourced an equivalent part. Equivalent parts require a change order, I said, which may be in the digital file. My inspection acknowledgement says I certified this assembly. You may have signed before the substitution, at 6:40, while I was at the hospital? Silence settled across the table. Franklin looked from me to Allison. Julian's tone remained composed. Then the document time may be a clerical error. We are dealing with several systems that do not always synchronize. A clerical error could explain a wrong time. It could not explain a forged signature, an inferior valve, or my dead badge opening the evidence warehouse after midnight. Franklin asked the photographer to document the model stamp and fracture surface. Then he requested the receiving record, installation order, and chain of custody folder. Allison opened the evidence cabinet. The folder was there. The original valve was not. According to our inspection photograph, the approved component had been removed from the Celestine during the claim examination and tagged separately because its serial plate had detached. The evidence index listed it as item C14. The shelf location beside that entry was empty. Franklin turned another page. A disposal authorization had been entered at 2:26 that morning, 13 minutes after my disabled badge opened warehouse 4. Reason, duplicate component, no evidentiary value. The signature at the bottom belonged to Tomas Alvarez. The man who had worked beside me for 31 years had certified that the original valve should be destroyed. Tomas's signature sat at the bottom of the disposal authorization in the same heavy block letters I had seen on thousands of work orders. There was no mistaking it. Franklin Moss asked Allison to seal the remaining Celestine evidence and suspend access to Warehouse 4 until Atlantic Mutual completed its review. Julian agreed immediately, calm as ever, as though the missing component were an administrative inconvenience. I watched Tomas through the open warehouse door. He stood 50 yards away beside the travel lift, signaling to a crane operator. His orange safety vest moved through the fog like a small flame. For 31 years, Tomas had been the first person I called when a repair looked wrong, and the last person to leave when a launch went late. He had carried Caroline's casket beside me. I did not wait. That was my mistake. I crossed the yard before Franklin finished packing his equipment. Tomas, he heard something in my voice and dismissed the 2 mechanics beside him. What happened? He asked. I held up the disposal sheet. His eyes dropped to the signature for less than a second. His face changed. Then he looked toward the administration building. You shouldn't be here. Maggie, that is your name. I know my name. You authorized the destruction of item C14 at 2:26 this morning. His jaw tightened. I signed a disposal form for the valve I inspected. The form said duplicate material. Did you see it? He reached for the paper, but I pulled it back. Did you see the component you ordered destroyed? Tomas glanced toward the cameras mounted beneath the maintenance roof. That glance should have stopped me. Instead, it convinced me he was hiding something. Maggie, he said quietly, go home. You used to tell Caroline there were only 2 reasons a man avoided a direct question. Shame or payment. His eyes hardened. Don't bring her into this, then answer me. A forklift engine idled nearby. Men were pretending not to listen. Tomas stepped closer. You want an answer in the middle of the yard. Fine, I signed what management gave me. I was told the item had no evidentiary value by Julian. By management, that is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting. The coldness in his voice stunned me more than the document had. I had expected denial, maybe fear. I had not expected anger. 31 years, I said. Exactly, Tomas replied. 31 years of cleaning up every emergency because you believed no one else could be trusted to do it right. His words landed where Julian's accusation had failed. Tomas lowered his voice. You are not the only person trying to keep this place alive. I heard footsteps behind me. Julian approached with Allison and two board members. Franklin followed at a distance, his expression already warning me that I had crossed from witness to problem. Julian looked at the disposal sheet in my hand. "Is this how you intend to cooperate with the investigation?" I asked my foreman why he destroyed evidence. "You confronted an employee in front of his crew. He signed the authorization, and Atlantic Mutual is reviewing it." Allison moved between us. "Aunt Maggie, give me the paper. It is a copy, then give it to me anyway." Her voice was firmer than it had been at the gala. Julian had taught her that firmness could disguise fear. I handed her the page. Julian addressed the employees watching from the service bay. "Everyone back to work, please." They moved at once. That obedience told me how quickly authority had changed hands. Julian waited until the yard noise resumed. "Your behavior is becoming a liability," he said. "My behavior found a substituted valve. Franklin found it because I identified it, and then you publicly accused a senior employee without evidence of motive." I asked him a question. "You cornered him." Thomas said nothing. That silence felt like confirmation. Allison pressed the paper against her chest. "We need to go upstairs." In the conference room, Julian closed the blinds. Board members Ruth Ellison and Peter Vance took seats near the far wall. Ruth represented the Employee Ownership Trust. Peter was a retired marina operator who had served beside me for 12 years. Neither looked comfortable. Julian placed a thin blue folder in front of me. "You forced this issue sooner than we intended." "What issue?" "Governance." He opened the folder and turned the first document around. It was an amendment to the Keene Harbor Works operating agreement dated September 14, 2022. I remembered the month. A hurricane had passed offshore, damaging 2 docks and flooding our electrical room. Caroline K. had worked 3 days moving disabled vessels. The amendment stated that during any declared insurance, safety, or liquidity crisis, the company's chief financial officer could appoint an interim operating administrator with authority over personnel, records, facilities, and vendor contracts. Allison was the CFO, Julian was the interim administrator. At the bottom of the final page appeared my notarized signature. "I have never seen this," I said. Peter cleared his throat. "Maggie, it was part of the storm continuity package. I signed temporary purchasing authority, not this." Julian tapped the paragraph granting him control of company records. "You signed the complete package. I would never grant an outside consultant authority over personnel." "You were exhausted," Allison said. "The yard was flooded. You signed dozens of documents." I read what I signed. Julian leaned back. "That certainty is precisely what concerns us." He began listing incidents. I had missed a lunch with the Harbor Commission. I had called a vendor by his father's name. I had left my reading glasses inside a survey case. Ordinary mistakes accumulated into a portrait of decline when arranged by someone who needed one. Ruth spoke carefully. "No one is saying you are incapable, Maggie. Then what are you saying?" "That the company needs stability while the insurer investigates." Julian slid another page toward me. It authorized an independent fitness assessment before I could regain operational access. There it was, the substituted valve, the false video, and the missing evidence had become secondary. The discussion was now about my memory. I had handed Julian that advantage when I crossed the yard in anger. I looked at Allison. "Do you believe I am losing my mind?" Her answer came too slowly. "I believe you are under tremendous strain." Julian folded his hands. "We all want to protect your legacy." I stopped arguing. Once people begin discussing you as a condition instead of a person, every defense becomes another symptom. I picked up the 2022 amendment and studied my signature. At first glance it was excellent. The capital M curved correctly. The final E lifted in the familiar way arthritis had changed my writing over the years. But the letters were spaced too evenly. My real signature compressed near the center because I wrote quickly. This one had been drawn by someone copying a model. The pressure was also wrong. Every stroke carried the same weight. A genuine signature moves with confidence. This one had been built slowly enough to be perfect. And perfection was the flaw. I left the conference room carrying nothing but my coat. The forged amendment remained on the table. So did the fitness assessment and every accusation Julian had arranged around me like furniture in a room he expected me to occupy. By the time I reached the parking lot, I understood the mistake I had made. I had treated the truth as if it were enough. For most of my career it had been a cracked weld, a false maintenance log, or a mismatched serial number eventually surrendered to measurement. Metal did not care who controlled the meeting, people did. Julian had not defeated my evidence. He had changed the subject from the evidence to me. If I continued fighting in public, he would keep presenting my resistance as proof that I was unstable, bitter, and unable to step aside. Allison would defend him because admitting he was dangerous would also mean admitting she had helped place him in power. I could not pull her out by force, so I stopped pulling. The following morning I called Allison. "I owe you an apology," I said. Silence followed. For what? For the scene with Tomas, for challenging Julian in front of the board. I let anger make me careless. Her voice softened immediately. "I know this is hard. I have spent 40 years believing the yard would collapse if I stopped watching it. It won't. I'm beginning to understand that the lie tasted cleaner than I expected. I told her I would submit to the independent assessment. I would stay away from daily operations and avoid speaking to employees about the investigation. I also said I wanted time to consider selling part of my ownership if retirement proved permanent." Allison inhaled sharply. "You would sell?" I said I would consider it. Julian believes bringing in a development partner could protect the company. I know what Julian believes. My old tone slipped through. I corrected it. He may be right about some things. That sentence opened the door. Within an hour, Julian called me himself. He was warm, patient, almost relieved. "This is a difficult transition," he said. "No one expects you to surrender your identity overnight. I don't have much interest in becoming one of those founders who haunts the hallway after everyone wants her gone. No one wants you gone." He said it beautifully. I could hear him smiling. We agreed that I would collect my personal belongings on Saturday when the administrative offices were closed. A staff member would supervise. My building access would remain suspended. Before ending the call, Julian mentioned a waterfront valuation group that could discreetly assess my shares. I pretended not to recognize the speed of it. "You already have someone in mind?" "Only as a contingency. Send me the information." He paused for half a second. That was the first sign I had given him exactly what he wanted. At noon, I met Dana Cho in the back booth of a seafood restaurant near Eastport. Dana had investigated marine claims for 26 years. She wore a gray jacket, ordered hot tea, and never wrote anything down until a person had finished speaking. I showed her the screenshots of the security alert, the forged inspection acknowledgement, and photographs Franklin had taken of the failed valve. She studied each page without reacting. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "To prove the claim was staged. That is a conclusion. To determine whether it was staged. Better." Dana tapped the warehouse alert. "You still had authorized access to this security system. Emergency notifications were sent to my personal device under the original service agreement. You did not enter the company network." "No. Did you remove documents from the yard?" "Only copies given to me as a board member or inspection witness." "Did you record private conversations?" "No." She nodded once. "Keep it that way. I wanted speed. Donna wanted evidence that would survive attorneys. She explained that Atlantic Mutual could open a special investigation only if the carrier had a documented basis beyond internal family conflict. A substituted component mattered. A missing evidence item mattered more. But neither proved who had changed the valve or why. "Julian controls the company records," I said. "Then company records are not where you begin." "Where do I begin? With information he cannot revise." Dana pointed toward the marina outside the window. "Independent delivery records, manufacturer batch numbers, gate vendors, fuel accounts, toll readers, outside cameras. Every operation touches systems it does not own." That was when I realized Julian's first weakness. He believed digital control meant total control. Inside Keene Harbor Works, he could change timestamps, restrict access, replace files, and produce whatever version of events Allison was willing to sign. But the yard did not exist alone. Parts arrived by truck, waste left by truck, contractors crossed public roads, ships moved with tides recorded by federal stations. Every lie he created inside our gates had to remain consistent with a world beyond them. And the outside world had no reason to protect him. I met Mara Bell that afternoon. Mara had handled our corporate and maritime work for 11 years. though Julian had begun routing routine contracts through another firm. Her office occupied the second floor of a converted brick house near Church Circle. She read the 2022 amendment slowly. This copy came from the board packet? Yes, and you deny signing it? I signed several emergency documents during the storm. Not this, we need the original. Julian controls it. Then we request it formally as part of a shareholder records inspection. He will know I'm still investigating. He already knows. The goal is not to hide your existence. It is to hide your direction. Mara advised me not to challenge the amendment yet. If we accuse Julian of forgery without an original document or expert examination, he could replace the evidence, invent a cleaner explanation, or pressure Allison into affirming that she had watched me sign. Instead, we would let him believe the amendment had worked. Mara drafted a short letter confirming my temporary withdrawal from operational duties while preserving my rights as a 45% shareholder. The wording sounded gracious and defeated. I signed it with the same compressed, uneven signature I had used for years. Then Mara photographed it beside the signature on Julian's amendment. The difference was obvious once someone knew where to look. 3 days later, I returned to the yard to collect my belongings. Kayla escorted me to the office. My books, photographs, and survey tools remained boxed. I moved slowly and allowed her to carry the heavier cartons. Employees watched from a distance. I made sure they saw an old woman leaving at the front door. I stopped beside the brass plaque that still read, "Keene Harbor Works." Julian stood behind the reception desk. "Take care of yourself, Maggie," he said. "I intend to." I smiled and drove away. That evening, a number I did not recognize called my phone. The man did not identify himself. "Bay Diner," he said. "Tomorrow 6:15, back booth." The line disconnected. I knew the voice. Tomas arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a faded work jacket and looking over his shoulder before sitting across from me. "I cannot stay," he said. "Then tell me why you signed the disposal form." His hands closed around the untouched coffee cup. "You are asking the wrong question. What is the right one?" He leaned across the table, speaking barely above the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. "Stop looking at the boats, Maggie." His eyes moved toward the parking lot. "Look at the trucks." Tomas left the diner before his coffee cooled. He did not explain why I should study the trucks. He did not tell me whether he had destroyed the original valve, hidden it, or watched someone else remove it from warehouse 4. He simply placed a $5 bill beneath his cup and walked through the side door. I waited 3 minutes before following. Outside, dawn had begun thinning the darkness above the harbor. Tomas's pickup was already gone. 2 men in reflective jackets smoked beside a delivery van, paying no attention to an old woman standing beneath a broken neon sign. I drove home with his words repeating in my head, "Look at the trucks." Every part entering Keene Harbor Works passed through our north gate. Large deliveries crossed a certified weighbridge installed after a hazardous waste audit 8 years earlier. The scale recorded the vehicle's license plate, arrival time, departure time, gross weight, and the badge used to authorize entry. Julian controlled the company database. He did not control the independent contractor that calibrated the scale or the state records required for environmental compliance. By 8:30, I was in Mara Bell's office. "We can request shareholder records," she said after hearing me out. "But if we ask specifically for truck logs, Julian will know exactly where you're looking." Dana said to use systems outside the yard. Mara considered that. Environmental disposal records are filed through a third-party portal. You remain listed as the responsible property owner with the county. So I can access them? You can access reports submitted under your name. You cannot use someone else's credentials or enter restricted company files. I have spent the last week being told what I cannot do. That is because what you do next has to survive people who are better at procedure than truth. She wrote down the name of the company that maintained our scale. Chesapeake Industrial Weighing. I recognized the owner, Everett Sloan, 20 years earlier. I had inspected a barge after a crane collapse nearly killed his brother. We were not friends, but he knew I did not make casual requests. I called from Mara's conference room. Everett answered on the third ring. "Maggie Keene. I heard you retired. News travels faster when it is wrong." He laughed once. "What do you need?" calibration records for my North Gate scale, and any archived transaction data your service agreement allows the property owner to review. His voice became cautious. Company records belong to the customer account. I am still a 45% owner and the responsible party on the environmental registration. That sounds like a question for lawyers. My lawyer is sitting beside me. Mara leaned toward the phone. We are requesting records maintained independently by Chesapeake Industrial Weighing, not access to Keene Harbor Works' internal database. Everett remained silent for several seconds. I can provide calibration certificates and system health logs, he said. Transaction backups may require written authorization. Send the form. An hour later, Mara submitted the request. By late afternoon, Everett delivered 3 months of archived weighbridge data to a secure legal portal. It was not complete enough to show what each truck carried, but it recorded weight changes the yard could not alter retroactively. Dana joined us by video call. We filtered the entries by date, then compared them against Julian's incident timeline. Most vehicles were ordinary: paint suppliers, fuel contractors, waste haulers, crane services. Their weights changed in predictable ways. One name appeared 6 times: East Channel Marine Logistics. I had never approved that vendor. The company's trucks entered after normal working hours, usually between midnight and 4 in the morning. Each entry was authorized under a temporary contractor code issued by the administration office. The most recent visit occurred 9 days before the Celestine failed. The truck arrived at 1:48 a.m., weighing 18,412 pounds. It left at 3:06, weighing 18,419, 7 pounds heavier. The approved silicon bronze valve weighed 3 pounds, 6 ounces. Its mounting hardware, removed serial plate, packing material, and sealed evidence container could account for the difference. Dana did not celebrate. 7 pounds is suggestive, she said, not proof. What would make it proof? A delivery manifest, receiving record, camera image, or matching batch number. I scrolled through earlier East Channel entries. On 3 occasions the truck entered light and departed significantly heavier. On 2 others, it arrived carrying loads that did not correspond to any purchase order I remembered. The pattern was wrong. A legitimate supplier delivered equipment and left lighter. East Channel sometimes entered with weight and removed more than it brought. Other times it appeared to exchange nearly identical loads. Parts substitution, I said. Dana nodded slowly. Potentially, approved components go in. Cheaper components replace them. The originals leave the yard and can be resold. Then failures create insurance claims or pressure on the company's policy. Mara looked toward me. A business that loses insurance also loses bargaining power. Julian had warned us that the yard could not survive another claim. He had presented himself as the person capable of finding a buyer before the bank acted. If he was creating the crisis, the sale was not rescue. It was the objective. We needed to identify who owned East Channel Marine Logistics. Maryland's Public Business Registry listed the company through a commercial registered agent. Its mailing address belonged to a shared office suite outside Baltimore. No officers appeared in the public filing. Dana said she could request additional information through Atlantic Mutual, but first the insurer needed a documented connection to the Celestine claim. The weighbridge log gave us one. Mara prepared a preservation notice ordering Keene Harbor Works, Chesapeake Industrial Weighing, and East Channel to retain all records related to the truck visits. She did not accuse anyone of fraud. She stated only that the information might be relevant to an existing insurance investigation. That distinction mattered. By sunset, I had the first piece of evidence Julian could not delete. A truck had entered my yard after midnight. It had remained there during the window when the Celestine's approved valve could have been removed. It left carrying weight that did not belong, but I still needed to know how East Channel had been paid. I reviewed copies of quarterly expense reports included in older board packets. Julian had buried the vendor under a broad category labeled Emergency Technical Services. 6 payments appeared across 12 weeks. The amounts ranged from $18,000 to $42,000. Each invoice described after-hours stabilization, specialty component sourcing, or expedited disposal. Together, they totaled $186,000. Every payment had bypassed the normal dual approval rule under the crisis authority granted by the forged 2022 amendment. Each had been authorized using the same executive credential. AR02 Allison read. I checked the numbers again, hoping exhaustion had rearranged them. It had not. The money leading to the substituted parts had not been approved by Julian. It had been approved by the girl I had raised. I did not call Allison. For most of her life, that would have been my first move. I would have shown her the invoices, demanded an explanation, and searched her face for the girl who used to wait beside my truck after school. That instinct had already cost me once. Dana asked me to send the 6 payment records through Mara's secure portal. Then she instructed me not to contact East Channel Marine or anyone connected to its invoices. If Allison approved them knowingly, she may warn Julian, Dana said. And if she approved them unknowingly, she may still warn her husband. The distinction was cruel, but accurate. Allison's credential appeared on every payment. That did not prove she understood what East Channel was doing. Executives approved bundled invoices every day, without inspecting the work behind each line. Julian might have framed them as emergency costs connected to insurance compliance. But Allison had allowed his system to replace ours. Whether she had helped build the trap or merely stopped asking questions, the result was the same. By Monday morning, the trap tightened around the yard. Atlantic Mutual Marine delivered a formal notice to the board. Unless Keene Harbor Works completed an independent safety review and explained the recent claims pattern, our commercial marine policy would not be renewed. The expiration date was 14 days away. The notice reached me through Mara because Julian had removed me from the company distribution list. The first page was technical, the second page was fatal. Without active liability and ship repair coverage, we could not legally accept most commercial work. Our largest customers would remove us from approved vendor lists. Vessels already in the yard might have to be transferred elsewhere. The bank reacted within 3 hours. Chesapeake Commercial Lending notified Allison that the company's revolving credit line depended on continuous insurance coverage. If Atlantic Mutual declined renewal, the bank reserved the right to suspend future advances and demand additional collateral. The yard could survive one bad quarter. It could not survive without payroll financing while millions of dollars in customer work remained unfinished. Julian called an emergency board meeting for Tuesday morning. Mara and I attended remotely from her office. My face appeared on a monitor at the far end of the conference table, smaller than everyone else's. Julian had arranged the room well. Allison sat at the head, though he controlled the presentation. Ruth Ellison represented the employee trust. Peter Vance sat beside Tomas, whose expression revealed nothing. A printed countdown appeared on the wall screen. 14 days to coverage expiration. Julian stood beneath it. We are not discussing blame today, he began. We are discussing survival. He presented the situation as a chain no one could break. Insurance uncertainty threatened the credit line. The credit line threatened payroll. Payroll threatened employee retention. If skilled workers left, the yard would lose existing contracts even if coverage were restored. Every statement was technically reasonable. That was what made Julian dangerous. He built lies from pieces of truth. We have received preliminary interest from a waterfront investment group, he continued. Blue Heron Waterfront Partners is willing to assume the yard's debt exposure, fund the insurance remediation, and guarantee employment for the current workforce. The screen changed. A polished rendering showed glass condominium towers where our fabrication sheds stood. Along the water, expensive restaurants curved around a private marina. A smaller repair facility appeared at the far edge of the property. They had reduced 41 years of labor to a decorative building beside luxury apartments. Ruth leaned toward the screen. How many jobs are guaranteed? All current positions for 18 months, Julian said. And after that, the business would be evaluated based on performance. Thomas finally spoke. So nothing is guaranteed after 18 months. No buyer guarantees eternity. Julian's smile never moved. Peter adjusted his glasses. What price are they offering? Enough to satisfy company obligations, stabilize the employee pension reserve, and provide shareholders with a responsible exit. That was not the question, I said through the monitor. Julian turned toward my image. The final valuation remains under negotiation. Then you are asking us to support a sale without naming the price. I am asking the board to authorize due diligence before the company loses negotiating leverage. Allison placed both palms on the table. Aunt Maggie, we do not have time for another fight. I ask for a number. Blue Heron's preliminary range is 28 to 32 million, she said. The waterfront land alone was worth more. 3 years earlier, a smaller marina across the creek had sold for 38 million without our dry storage buildings, machine shop, travel lift, or commercial permits. Julian knew that, so they are buying distressed property, I said. They are buying risk, he answered. Risk you identified before anyone else. His eyes narrowed slightly. Mara touched my wrist beneath the conference table. A warning. I leaned back and softened my voice. Perhaps I am still thinking like someone who expects the yard to remain unchanged. The tension in the boardroom eased. Julian studied me. I know this is painful. I am trying to be practical. Allison looked relieved, and the relief hurt more than suspicion would have. Julian proposed a resolution authorizing management to open a secure data room, provide Blue Heron with financial records, and negotiate a non-binding letter of intent. The employee trust held 15% of the voting interest. Allison controlled 40%, I controlled 45%. A final asset sale required at least 55% approval. Julian needed Allison and the employees. He did not need me. That explained the public campaign. Removing me from operations was not enough. He needed Ruth and the workers to believe that opposing the sale would destroy their own jobs. Thomas voted against opening negotiations. Peter abstained. Ruth requested 3 days to consult employees. Allison voted yes. The resolution remained pending. After the meeting, Dana called. Atlantic Mutual has accepted the preservation notice, she said. They are opening a special review of East Channel. Will they renew the policy? Not in 14 days unless the yard demonstrates control of the risk. Julian created the risk, then prove it before the company runs out of time. That afternoon, Harper sent me a message from a personal address. She had been assigned to review maintenance schedules as part of her internship. She attached no company files. Instead, she asked one question: why was the Caroline K scheduled for an overnight sea trial? I called her. Who authorized it? Uncle Julian. He says the insurance consultants need performance data before renewal. When? The night before the policy expires. I looked through my study window toward the creek. Caroline K was 48 years old but sound. Her pumps had been rebuilt the previous winter. Her engines were dependable. There was no legitimate reason to test her overnight under an expiring policy. Who is going aboard? I asked. Captain Webb, 2 mechanics, and maybe me. No, Harper went quiet. Aunt Maggie, you will not board that tug. I'm an engineering intern. They need someone logging pump data. Find a reason to be unavailable. She heard something in my voice. What do you think is going to happen? I did not answer because I did not know yet. Then Harper sent a photograph of the schedule. Beside the Caroline K entry, someone had added a handwritten note in black ink. Complete before coverage termination. No delay accepted. 14 days remained before the company lost its insurance. 13 days remained before Julian sent my sister's tug into the dark. 3 days after the emergency board meeting, 48 employees gathered inside the fabrication shed. The welding tables had been pushed against the walls. Folding chairs filled the concrete floor beneath the gantry crane. Men and women who normally wore respirators and coveralls sat with their hands clasped between their knees, waiting to hear whether the place that fed their families would still exist by the end of the month. Julian stood on a temporary platform beside Allison and Ruth Ellison. I arrived last. The room changed when people saw me. Conversations stopped. A mechanic near the back started to rise, then looked toward Julian and remained seated. I walked to the front. Julian offered me the microphone. This is your meeting, he said. No, it is theirs. For most of my life I had spoken to crews after storms, lawsuits, and accidents. I had never found words difficult until that morning. I owe all of you an apology, I began. Thomas stood against the far wall, his arms folded. I allowed my disagreement with management to become public. I confronted people before the insurance investigation was complete. Whatever my intentions, I added fear to an already difficult situation. Julian lowered his head with rehearsed respect. Keene Harbor Works does not belong only to the name over the gate. It belongs to the people who have spent years inside these buildings. If opening our records to Blue Heron gives us a chance to preserve your jobs and protect the pension reserve, I will not interfere with that process. A murmur moved through the shed. I had chosen my words with Mara. I did not endorse the sale or surrender my voting rights. I agreed only not to obstruct due diligence. To Julian, it sounded like defeat. I am also willing to consider selling my ownership. I said, if an independent review proves that doing so is the best way to protect this workforce. Allison's eyes filled. She believed I had finally chosen her judgment over my pride. That was the cruelest part of the performance. Julian stepped beside me and placed one hand lightly between my shoulders. Maggie's willingness to put the company first is exactly why her legacy will endure. He had publicly removed me 5 nights earlier. Now he praised my legacy as though I had already died. The employees applauded. Some did it from relief, some from loyalty, and others because applause was easier than deciding whom to trust. Thomas did not move. After the meeting, Julian invited me to Allison's office. Coffee had been prepared beside a preliminary confidentiality agreement from Blue Heron. You did the right thing, Allison said. I hope so. You gave everyone room to breathe. Julian poured my coffee himself. Blue Heron wants to understand the property's history, he said. Permits, shoreline agreements, environmental reports. Much of it predates the digital archive. It is in the family records room. Caroline and I had stored every original waterfront document above the old rigging shop. Julian had restricted my operational access, but those records belong to the ownership group. Are you asking for my help? I am asking whether you would review the historical files with a staff escort. He wanted me occupied with harmless paper, while his people controlled the financial data. I let him see hesitation. I do not want anyone saying I tampered with records. We will create an access list, Allison said. You may enter only the family archive and upstairs washroom. Kayla will log your arrival and departure, and my phone. Julian smiled. You may keep it. We are not imprisoning you. Not yet, I thought. I signed after Mara reviewed the agreement. It restricted Blue Heron information, but did not prevent me from examining corporate records I already had a right to see. For 4 days, I returned to the yard between 10 and 2. I moved slowly through deeds, permits, harbor letters, and photographs from the company's first years. Kayla checked on me each hour. Cameras watched the hallway. I behaved exactly as Julian expected. I asked sentimental questions, paused over photographs, and pretended to lose track of which box I had opened. Meanwhile, I built a map. The archive shared a wall with the old communications closet. A service conduit ran from there, toward the modern server room, added during our renovation. The original plans revealed power routes, drainage lines, and a maintenance corridor Julian might not know I remembered. I did not enter it. I photographed only ownership, easement, and environmental documents. Mara received copies through a secure channel. Dana compared old equipment contracts against East Channel invoices. Julian visited on the 4th afternoon. He leaned against the doorway while I sorted survey maps. How are you feeling? Older than the paper. You seem calmer. I have less to control. He studied me. Blue Heron may make a formal offer sooner than expected. How soon? Within a week and the insurance deadline. We are handling it. He said it with such confidence that I knew something had shifted in his favor. That evening, Harper came to my house. She parked 2 streets away and entered through the creekside door. Her hair was damp from rain and she carried no company computer. Mom thinks you accepted the sale, she said. Do you? No. She placed her personal phone on the kitchen table. I have been checking equipment logs for the Caroline K. Last night, the pump monitoring data disappeared from the shared engineering folder. Deleted, moved, or copied, I cannot tell without administrator access. Do not try to get it, I didn't. My internship requires me to photograph the generator panel during midnight load tests. I was across the yard when I saw someone enter the server room. The first image showed a figure beneath the security light. The second was clearer. Julian stood at the server room door, looking over one shoulder. In his left hand was a black external drive. The timestamp read 12:07 a.m. in the third photograph. The door was open. Julian was stepping inside. I did not enlarge the photographs on Harper's phone. I did not send them to Dana or Mara, not yet. A photograph of Julian carrying a storage drive into the server room after midnight looked suspicious. But suspicion was not the same as lawful access to whatever he had copied. Harper had taken the images from a place she was authorized to be. That made the photographs useful. It did not give us permission to follow him into the system. "Did he see you?" I asked. "No. Did you tell your mother?" Harper shook her head. "Good, keep it that way." Her expression tightened. "You sound like you don't trust her." "I trust that your mother is afraid. That is not the same thing." "No, it is worse." Fear made people predictable. Allison's first instinct would be to confront Julian privately, giving him time to erase records and replace explanations. She had spent years believing that every problem in her marriage could be solved if she asked the right question gently enough. I had once believed the same thing about family. I photographed Harper's screen using my own phone, preserving the visible timestamps and location metadata. Then I made her write a short statement describing where she had been, why she was there, and what she personally observed. She frowned at the paper. "You make everything sound like a deposition. Memory changes when people are frightened. Paper changes less." The next morning, Mara sent the photographs to Dana through Atlantic Mutual's secure evidence portal. The carrier's investigation unit issued a formal preservation demand for server access logs, external device records, deleted maintenance files, and all electronic data connected to the Caroline K. Julian received the notice before noon. At 12:17 he called me. "You've been busy," he said. "I have been sorting shoreline permits. Atlantic Mutual suddenly wants server logs. Perhaps they are investigating. Someone gave them a reason." His tone remained smooth, but the warmth was gone. "Are you accusing me of something?" I asked. "I'm trying to determine whether you are still cooperating with the process you publicly supported." I said I would cooperate with due diligence. I did not promise to prevent an insurer from doing its job. A pause followed. "You should be careful, Maggie. If this review delays the sale, 48 families may blame you." There was his favorite weapon, not anger, responsibility. "I have been blamed before," I said. I ended the call before he could hear how much the threat had clarified. Julian was no longer trying to convince me the sale was necessary. He was trying to make investigation socially expensive. That afternoon, Mara uncovered the first connection between East Channel Marine and Blue Heron Waterfront Partners. Neither company listed Julian's name. East Channel was owned by a Delaware limited liability company called Armitage Coastal Holdings. Armitage, in turn, was managed through a Baltimore trust administration firm. Blue Heron used a separate structure, with its public filings naming 2 real estate investors and a retired banker. On paper, the companies were unrelated. Mara examined their registered addresses, legal representatives, and financing disclosures. One name appeared in both sets of documents: Calder Pike. Pike was a transactional attorney who had represented Julian during the redevelopment of a failed marina near Norfolk. That project had ended in foreclosure, unpaid contractors, and a lawsuit settled under confidentiality. "Shared counsel is not ownership," Mara warned me. "But it is a door. It is a door we need permission to open." Dana obtained that permission through the insurance review. East Channel had received payments tied to active claims, giving Atlantic Mutual grounds to request beneficial ownership information and banking records. The answer arrived. 2 days later, Armitage Coastal Holdings was controlled by a private investment account held for Julian Reed. He had not merely recommended East Channel. He owned the company receiving our money. The 6 invoices Allison approved had transferred $186,000 from Keene Harbor Works into an entity controlled by her husband. Mara laid the report on her conference table. "That is self-dealing," she said. "At minimum, it violates his consulting agreement and fiduciary duties. At maximum, fraud depending on what services were actually performed." Dana appeared on the screen at the end of the room. "We are not finished." She displayed a diagram connecting East Channel, Armitage, and Blue Heron. 6 months earlier, Julian's investment account had received an option for a 3% development participation in any waterfront project Blue Heron completed on the Keene Harbor property. 3% sounded small until Mara calculated the projected value. If the condominiums, marina, and retail complex were approved, Julian's participation could be worth more than $9 million. He had created a failing company, introduced the buyer, and positioned himself to profit from the land after the yard disappeared. Allison's proposed sale price no longer seemed merely low. It had been engineered to look merciful. I stared at the rendering Blue Heron had presented. Glass towers stood where our machine shop and fabrication shed now operated. The Caroline K did not appear anywhere in the image. "Why damage the boats?" I asked. He already had the company under financial pressure. Dana changed the screen. A spreadsheet listed our recent claims, policy limits, deductibles, and reserve values. The Celestine incident was expensive but manageable. The earlier steering and electrical claims had raised concerns without exhausting coverage. Then she highlighted the Caroline K. The tug was insured for $4.8 million under an agreed value hull policy. Additional coverage applied to environmental cleanup, salvage, and business interruption. If the tug suffers a total loss before the policy terminates, Dana said, the claim could produce enough cash to cover immediate debt and make the sale appear cleaner. And if the claim is denied, Julian expects control of the records. He may believe he can establish mechanical failure. I remembered the disappearing pump data and the midnight server visit. He is building the failure before it happens. That is our working theory. Mara folded her arms. Can Atlantic Mutual stop the sea trial? Not without alerting him that we suspect deliberate loss. The carrier can request an inspection, but management may claim operational necessity and move the schedule. Then we warn the crew. Dana's expression did not change. Based on what? A handwritten note, deleted data, and financial motive. If Julian cancels the trial, removes the device, and destroys the remaining evidence, we lose the strongest chance to prove intent. I rose from my chair. You are discussing a boat as if it will be empty. Dana looked directly at me. No, Maggie, that is exactly why I called. She opened the overnight trial roster, Captain Webb, 2 mechanics, 1 engineering intern, Harper Reed. Then Dana said the words that changed the entire shape of the case. If Julian intends to sink the Caroline K, he may not care whether the people aboard make it back. I drove straight to Harper's apartment. She opened the door wearing socks and an old Keene Harbor Works sweatshirt Caroline had given Allison years before Harper was born. A half-finished engineering model covered her dining table. "You cannot go on that sea trial," I said. She stared at me. "You already told me that." This time I am not asking. Her expression hardened in a way that belonged to both her mother and me. If something is wrong with the pumps, that is exactly why an engineering intern should be there. If something is deliberately wrong, your presence will not protect the boat. What do you know? I could not tell her everything. The investigation was still fragile, and Harper's loyalty to Allison made every disclosure dangerous. But I had no right to demand blind obedience after spending a lifetime teaching her to ask for evidence. "Julian has a financial interest in Blue Heron," I said. "He also controls the company, receiving the emergency payments your mother approved." Harper lowered herself into a chair. "Mom knows." "I do not know. You think Uncle Julian is causing the failures?" "I think he is creating a record that makes the yard look unsafe and desperate." "And the Caroline K? The tug is worth more to him as an insurance claim than as part of a working boatyard." Harper looked toward the rain-darkened window. "He would not put people aboard if he planned to sink it." "You are trying to measure him by your own limits." She said nothing. I sat across from her. "Tell management you have a fever. Break your wrist if you must. You will not be on that boat." She gave me a tired, angry look. "You used to say a Keene does not run from a machine because someone claims it is dangerous. A Keene also knows the difference between a machine and a trap." That reached her. She agreed to withdraw from the trial, but only if Dana found a lawful way to protect Captain Webb and the mechanics. I promised we would try. I did not promise success. The next morning, Dana, Mara, and I met inside a private conference room at Atlantic Mutual's regional office. Franklin Moss joined us with 2 specialists from the carrier's fraud unit. For the first time, every piece of evidence occupied the same table. The altered video, the impossible tide, The forged inspection acknowledgement, the inferior valve, the missing original component, the warehouse access at 2:13 a.m., East Channel's truck arriving and leaving 7 pounds heavier. The 6 payments authorized under Allison's credential. Julian's ownership of East Channel, his hidden participation in the Blue Heron project. The missing pump data, the photographs of him entering the server room after midnight. Alone, each item could be explained. Together, they formed a structure. Dana stood at the wall, arranging dates on a whiteboard. Julian's defense will be that these are unrelated irregularities, she said. A clerical error, a supplier substitution, an overbroad emergency payment, a routine server backup, and the development participation. I asked, an undisclosed conflict, serious but not proof of sabotage. Mara tapped the table. We need something physical connecting him, or East Channel, to the substituted equipment. The failed valve has East Channel's model number, I said. It proves the part came from a rejected product line. It does not prove who installed it. Franklin opened the Celestine evidence inventory. The original approved valve would help. It should carry Keene Harbor's inspection mark and manufacturer batch number. It was destroyed, no, I said. Everyone looked at me. I remembered Tomas in the diner. His warning, his refusal to answer the obvious question. Stop looking at the boats. Look at the trucks. He signed a form saying it was destroyed, I continued. That is not the same as destroying it. Dana's eyes narrowed. You believe he kept it? I believe Tomas was frightened enough to lie, and loyal enough to leave me a direction. Mara did not share my certainty. If he possesses evidence and failed to disclose it to the carrier, he has exposed himself. He knows, then why has he not come forward? Because Julian has something over him. The answer arrived that afternoon. Tomas called from a public phone outside a hardware store. His voice was low and rushed. Old rail yard, he said. 5:30, come alone. Mara objected. Dana objected more strongly. I went anyway, but not alone in the way Tomas meant. Dana parked 2 blocks away. Mara knew the location. I carried no recording device because Maryland law and our circumstances made secret recording more complicated than the risk justified. The abandoned rail yard sat beyond a row of marine warehouses. Rusted tracks disappeared into weeds. Tomas waited beside a corrugated storage building, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. You should not have told me to look at the trucks, I said. I should not have told you anything. Why did you? He turned away. Julian gave me a list of 12 employees he planned to eliminate after the sale. Men with injuries, older welders, people whose pension benefits cost too much, so you signed his disposal form. He told me the valve was a duplicate, and the insurer had already photographed it. When I saw the tag, I knew it was the one you inspected. Why sign? Because he showed me draft documents freezing the employee pension reserve during restructuring. He said if I refused, Blue Heron would classify the plan as underfunded and force everyone into court for years. You believed him? I believed he was capable of trying. Thomas unlocked the storage building. Inside were old rigging chains, wooden pallets, and a dented red toolbox. He removed a key taped beneath a workbench and opened the bottom drawer. A sealed plastic evidence bag lay beneath several welding masks. Inside it was a dark red-brown bronze valve. Even before I saw the stamped serial plate, I recognized the shallow diagonal line beside the flange. My inspection mark, Thomas had not destroyed item C14. He had switched the disposal bag before East Channel's truck left the yard. I thought I was protecting the crew, he said. Then the Celestine failed. I realized Julian was not only stealing parts. He needed the boats to break. I did not touch the bag. Dana entered and photographed it where it lay. Tomas signed a statement describing when and why he removed it. The carrier's evidence specialist sealed it inside a second container and documented the transfer. For the first time, we had a physical object Julian believed no longer existed. The original valve proved that an approved component had been removed after my inspection and replaced with a cheaper model before the yacht failed. It was not enough to finish the case. It was enough to begin building the trap. As Dana carried the sealed evidence toward her car, my phone vibrated. A photograph had been sent from an unknown number. It showed me standing beside Tomas inside the storage building. The image had been taken less than a minute earlier. Beneath it were 5 words, "He knows you are looking." The photograph changed our timetable. Someone had followed me to the rail yard, watched Tomas open the storage building, and remained close enough to photograph us through a gap in the corrugated wall. Julian did not yet know what Tomas had saved. If he had known, the message would have demanded the valve. Instead, it warned me that our secrecy was gone. Dana ordered the evidence transferred immediately to Atlantic Mutual's secured facility outside Baltimore. Tomas's statement, the original valve, and every photograph from the storage building traveled in separate sealed containers with documented custody. Mara drove Tomas to a hotel registered under her firm's account. He resisted. "I have a wife," he said. "I have a house. You also have someone photographing you beside evidence worth millions of dollars," Mara replied. "Tonight you have a hotel." I returned home after dark. Nothing appeared disturbed. The creekside door remained locked. The alarm log showed no entry. Even so, I walked from room to room checking windows, closets, and the shadowed corners where fear likes to invent shapes. On my kitchen table sat the agreement Julian had sent that afternoon. Blue Heron Waterfront Partners wanted formal access to the company's records. Their preliminary offer would remain open only if due diligence began within 48 hours. They were accelerating, so were we. The following morning, Mara, Dana, and I met in Mara's office before sunrise. A pot of coffee grew bitter between us while we reconstructed Julian's position. He believed the altered footage had removed me from operations. He believed the original valve was destroyed. He believed Allison controlled 40% of the company, and that Ruth could be frightened into delivering the employee trust's 15%. He believed the insurance deadline would force everyone to accept Blue Heron's price. And now he knew I was investigating. "We cannot keep collecting evidence while waiting for him to make the next move," I said. Dana closed the case file. "Then we give him a move to make." Mara turned toward the window. Church Circle was still dark beyond the glass. "A formal sale process creates duties he cannot avoid," she said. "Once Blue Heron enters due diligence, management has to provide representations about ownership, related party transactions, environmental liabilities, insurance claims, and the accuracy of company records. Julian has already lied about all of those things, privately. We need him to certify the lies." Dana understood first. "You want him to put the fraud inside the transaction." Mara nodded. A seller's certification was more than a presentation or reassuring email. It was a signed statement made to induce a multi-million-dollar purchase. If Julian denied ownership of East Channel, concealed his participation in Blue Heron, or certified that no claims had been manipulated, he would create evidence with his own signature. But the trap carried risk. To reach that point, we had to let the sale advance. Blue Heron would receive access to real financial records. Employees would believe the yard was being sold. The bank might begin preparing for a transfer. If Julian sensed anything wrong before signing, he could withdraw, blame the insurance crisis, and destroy what remained. "We need a data room he trusts," Mara said, "a data room he controls." I asked. "One he believes he controls." She proposed using an independent transaction platform managed by her firm. Blue Heron, Julian, Allison, and approved advisors would receive separate credentials. Every upload, edit, download, and deletion would be logged by the outside provider. Julian could decide what files to submit. He could not alter the history of what he submitted. Dana would use Atlantic Mutual's existing investigation to require that all claim-related documents uploaded for the sale match the records supplied to the insurer. Any inconsistency would become another documented act. I looked at the diagram Mara had drawn. "What do I do?" "You stop resisting," she said, "publicly and privately. I already apologized. You need to give Julian something more valuable than an apology. My cooperation, your credibility." Julian needed buyers and employees to believe the founder endorsed the process. If I agreed to help populate the historical section of the data room, he would see it as proof that I had accepted retirement. In exchange, we would request standard protections for all shareholders. Mara drafted the conditions. Before any binding sale, management would have to certify. No undisclosed financial interest in the buyer. No unreported related party vendor payments. No material falsification of maintenance, safety, or insurance records. No known event likely to cause a major claim before closing. No destruction or alteration of relevant evidence, Each statement would be signed individually, by Allison as CFO and Julian as interim operating administrator. Will he agree? I asked. He has to, Mara said. Refusing ordinary disclosures would alarm Blue Heron and the employee trust. And Allison? She will sign if Julian tells her the statements are routine. The thought sat heavily in the room. Our plan could catch Allison beside him. I had spent days asking whether she was victim, accomplice, or both. The law might not care about the emotional difference if she knowingly signed false documents. Mara read my face. You cannot design this around saving her from every consequence. I promised her mother. You promised to protect a 19-year-old girl. Allison is 43. Dana's voice was quieter. You can give her a chance to choose. You cannot choose for her. That became the center of the plan. We would not warn Allison, but the disclosures would be written in plain language. No buried clauses, no technical fog. When the time came, she would see exactly what she was being asked to certify. If she knew the truth, she could refuse. If she did not know, the questions might finally force her to look. That afternoon I called Julian. I reviewed Blue Heron's request. I said I will support opening the data room. His relief arrived disguised as caution. That is encouraging. I have conditions, of course. Marabelle will host the platform. Every shareholder receives access reports. Management signs standard conflict and record accuracy certifications before any binding agreement. A silence followed. You are making this more complicated than necessary. I am making it clean. Blue Heron has its own attorneys, and I have 45% of the company. He recovered quickly. These are reasonable protections. I'm sure we can accommodate them. I will also help organize the historical property records. That would mean a great deal to Allison. He believed I was returning to the role he had written for me. Sentimental founder, useful only for old documents and ceremonial approval. By evening, Mara's firm opened the data room. The first uploads came from Allison's office. Audited statements, payroll summaries, insurance notices, environmental permits, and vendor contracts. At 9:42 p.m., Julian uploaded a folder labeled Ministerial Claim History. At 9:47, he deleted it. At 9:51, he uploaded a replacement with the same name. The independent platform preserved both versions. Dana compared them before midnight. The first folder contained a spreadsheet with a row that did not appear in the replacement. Caroline K. projected total loss. Final claim before termination. Beside it was a date. The sea trial had been moved forward by 4 days. The new sea trial date appeared in the data room at 11:18 the next morning. Julian had moved the Caroline K. departure from Friday night to Tuesday, less than 36 hours away. His explanation was brief. Accelerated testing required to support insurance renewal. Dana immediately asked Atlantic Mutual to schedule an inspection before departure. The carrier agreed, but Julian replied that the tug's operational window depended on weather, crew availability, and harbor traffic. He was preparing to move whenever it suited him. Mara wanted me to stay away from the yard. I went anyway. My agreement still allowed me to organize historical files for Blue Heron, and disappearing now would confirm that I knew the deleted spreadsheet mattered. Kayla logged me in at 10:04. I carried 2 empty document boxes upstairs and settled into the family archive. Through the wall, I could hear employees moving between the communications closet and Julian's temporary office. At 11:30, Julian entered carrying a purchase report. He closed the door behind him. Blue Heron has questions about some older equipment standards, he said. Then they should hire a surveyor. They asked whether the yard historically approved substitutions during urgent repairs. I continued sorting shoreline permits, sometimes never below the required specification. Julian placed the report on the table. One line had been highlighted, Valve Assembly SB77 Forn. Do you recognize that model? I did, or rather I recognized that it did not exist. The prefix belonged to Seabright Foundry, a manufacturer we had used for decades. But Seabright's bronze cooling valves were numbered in the 400 series. A designation beginning with 77 referred to deck hardware, not engine room plumbing. Julian had constructed the code from 2 legitimate systems. He was testing whether I was still sharp enough to catch it. I looked at the page for longer than necessary. SB7714, I repeated. Yes, my professional instinct wanted to correct him immediately. 40 years of habit pressed the answer against my teeth. I let my forehead crease. That was a seawater valve on which vessel? The Marabelle. Julian said nothing. There had never been a Marabelle at our yard. I turned the report sideways, pretending to study it again. No, wait, the Marion, another non-existent vessel. Julian pulled out the chair across from me. Are you certain? I rubbed one thumb across the edge of the paper. I remember ordering two. Seabright says the model number is invalid. I looked up slowly. Then I remembered it wrong. The words were harder to say than any accusation. Julian watched my face. I allowed embarrassment to enter it, not too much. People pretending confusion often perform it broadly. Real uncertainty tends to become quiet. I may be mixing it up with another assembly, I said. His shoulders relaxed. That is understandable. There was triumph beneath the kindness. He had brought me a false part number, expecting the marine surveyor who built the company to expose herself. Instead, he believed he had confirmed the story he was telling Allison, that I was declining, unreliable, and no longer capable of challenging his technical claims. He took the report back. You should not be ashamed of needing help. I am learning that. He stood but did not leave. One other matter. He removed a security printout from inside the report. The page showed access activity from the night Harper photographed him entering the server room. Her internship badge had opened the East Maintenance Corridor at 11:58 p.m. A second reader recorded it beside the server room 9 minutes later. Julian placed his finger on the entry. Why was Harper here? She was assigned to generator testing. The test ended at 11:40. Then perhaps she left late. The corridor camera failed during the same 12-minute period. I gave him a tired look. You seem to have an answer already, I asked Harper this morning. She said she was checking a panel. That sounds reasonable. That panel is on the opposite side of the building. He stepped closer. Did you ask her to photograph me? The room became very still. Outside, a forklift reversed, its warning alarm repeating through the wall. I could deny everything. Julian would question Harper again, search her phone, and remove her from the yard before we learned what he had copied. So I gave him a smaller truth wrapped around a lie. I asked Harper to retrieve something for me. His eyes sharpened. What? My old vibration meter. I believed it was still in the service cabinet, near the communications corridor. Why would you need it? I wanted to examine the Caroline K before the sea trial. You are prohibited from operational work. I know. Did Harper enter the server room? No. Did she photograph anything? Not for me. That answer was technically true. I had not asked her to take the photographs. She had done it on her own. Julian studied me for several seconds. You involved your granddaughter in an insurance investigation. I involved her in retrieving a tool. You used her badge to bypass your restrictions. I made the request. Harper followed it, because she has spent her life trying not to disappoint this family. His expression shifted at that. I had given him what he needed. A reason to view Harper's corridor access as another act of an interfering old founder. If someone must be disciplined, I said, discipline me. You no longer work here, then you have already done it. Julian folded the printout and slipped it into his jacket. The Caroline K trial has been moved again, he said. Weather window, she leaves tonight. My chair scraped against the floor. Atlantic Mutual has not inspected her. The carrier was invited. Management cannot suspend essential operations because an investigator prefers another schedule. Who will be aboard? That is no longer your concern. He left before I could stop him. I called Harper. No answer. I called again. Her phone went directly to voicemail. Dana began contacting Atlantic Mutual. Mara called the harbor master. I drove toward the yard, but traffic had stopped behind an overturned delivery truck near the bridge. At 5:26, Tomas called. Wind tore through the connection. Behind him, I heard engines and men shouting. Julian fired me, he said. Security walked me off the property. Where is Harper? I thought she withdrew. So did I. She came aboard for a dockside pump calibration. They told her the sea trial was tomorrow. A horn sounded through the phone. Thomas, his voice broke. The Caroline K left the pier 20 minutes ago. He paused. Harper is still on her. I reached the harbor road at 5:41. The Caroline K was already beyond Spa Creek, moving east beneath storm clouds. From the overlook, she looked small against the dark water, her work lights glowing through mist. Harper was somewhere aboard. I called Captain Webb's mobile phone. No answer. I tried the tug's bridge line and heard only a recorded message. Dana reached the harbor master first. She said Atlantic Mutual had opened a fraud investigation and requested that the tug return. Julian countered within minutes. He claimed the insurer had no authority to halt a company vessel. The trial was essential to restoring coverage, and I was using family influence to disrupt operations. The harbor master could not order the Caroline K back without evidence of immediate danger. At 5:48, the tug's automatic identification signal disappeared. That was enough for me. Commercial vessels did not vanish from tracking during a routine trial. Someone had shut off the transponder or cut power. I drove to the Eastport Marina, where Tomas waited beside a 24-foot pilot boat owned by Captain Ellis Ward. Dana arrived carrying a waterproof case and a marine radio. Ellis looked at us. "You are asking me to chase a company tug into worsening weather without a distress call. My granddaughter is aboard. That does not make it legal." "No, but this matters." I showed him the tide table. High tide would peak at 7:02. A southeast wind was pushing additional water into the bay. If the Caroline K lost pumping capacity, the rising water would conceal the first flooding while increasing pressure on compromised discharge lines. I pointed toward the harbor entrance. "Webb will test her near the old dredge channel. If the pumps fail there, the flood current will carry her toward the shoal north of Greenberry Point. Once she turns broadside, the wind will hold her." Ellis studied the water. "You sound certain." "I surveyed that tug for 34 years. He started the engines. We cleared the marina at 5:57. The pilot boat struck the chop hard. Dana called the Coast Guard while Tomas scanned through binoculars. At 6:11, broken speech came through Channel 16. "Engine room taking." Static swallowed the rest. Then Harper's voice returned. "Caroline K, loss of primary bilge pumps, manual backup not responding. 4 persons aboard." Dana seized the microphone. "Caroline K, state your position." Captain Webb answered. "Position display is down, steering sluggish, port list increasing." I studied the shoreline and calculated backward. They had left 20 minutes before Tomas called at normal trial speed. They should have been south of the dredge channel. But the southeast gust pressed rain against my left cheek. The flood current was setting north faster than forecast. "Turn 10 degrees starboard," I told Ellis. "That takes us toward the shoal. That is where the current is taking them." At 6:19, Tomas spotted the mast light. The Caroline K emerged through the rain nearly half a mile ahead, listing to port. Water poured weakly from one discharge outlet, then stopped. Her stern sat low, and each wave climbed farther over the aft deck. The engine room hatch stood open. Harper waited beside it in a life jacket, gripping the rail. I had never known fear to feel so quiet. Ellis brought us alongside, but Captain Webb refused to evacuate immediately. Abandoning the tug would leave her drifting across the channel. "Fluting source," I shouted. Harper pointed below. "Port sea chest compartment. Pump panel is live, but the motor controls keep dropping out." A functioning panel with dead controls meant something was interrupting the command circuit. I knew the tug's compartments, but I could no longer climb those ladders. Tomas could. He crossed over with Dana's evidence case clipped to his jacket. Harper led him below while I directed by radio. "Check the manual bypass, it is locked open." Tomas replied, "Follow the control cable aft. Look for anything newer than the surrounding wiring." 30 seconds passed. Harper's voice came through. "There is a black relay box behind the junction panel. No yard label. Do not pull it yet." Dana said, "Photograph it in place." The list worsened. A loose drum rolled across the aft deck and struck the bulwark. Webb shouted that water had reached the lower generator mount. We no longer had time for a perfect evidence scene. "Photograph it," I said, "then bridge the original circuit around it." Tomas understood. He had installed the tug's first automatic pumps with me decades earlier. Harper sent the photographs. Tomas isolated the new relay and restored the old control path with an emergency jumper. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then both bilge pumps started. Water surged from the discharge ports in thick streams. The tug did not rise immediately, but the list stopped increasing. The Coast Guard arrived at 6:34 and established a tow line before the Caroline K reached the shoal. By then, The tide had climbed within inches of the mark I had predicted. Harper transferred to the pilot boat. She stepped into my arms, soaking wet and shaking with anger. "He told us the alarm was a sensor fault," she said. Julian said to continue. "Dana received the relay after the Coast Guard photographed its location and removal. It was an industrial remote switch hidden inside an unmarked housing. With the right signal, someone could disable the pumps without entering the engine room. We had the mechanism, we had 4 living witnesses, and Julian still believed the Caroline K would not return." At 7:12, while the tug was escorted back through the harbor, Allison called Harper. Her voice was frantic. "Where are you?" "Julian says the trial was canceled." Before Harper could answer, Mara called my second line. "The gala signing is still happening tonight," she said. Julian moved it forward. "Blue Heron's principals are already coming. He knows the tug survived." "Not yet. He just certified in writing that no material incident occurred." I looked across the water at the Caroline K, wounded but afloat. Julian thought the evidence had sunk with her. In less than 2 hours, he was going to sign the sale. By 8 o'clock, the old sail loft no longer looked like a place where nets had once dried from ceiling beams. Blue Heron had transformed it into a showroom. Spotlights illuminated a scale model of the proposed waterfront development. Glass towers rose from a miniature shoreline where our machine shop, fabrication shed, and travel lift had been erased. Tiny plastic sailboats floated beside a private marina. A row of artificial trees concealed the narrow repair facility Blue Heron claimed would preserve our maritime heritage. At the center of the room stood a long table covered in navy cloth. 6 leather folders waited beneath the cameras. Julian had turned a desperate transaction into a coronation. Local reporters gathered beside the windows. Bank representatives spoke quietly with Blue Heron's attorneys. City officials admired the model, while servers carried trays of champagne through the crowd. 48 employees had been invited, though fewer than half attended. Those who came stood together near the rear wall. Ruth Ellison remained with them, wearing the expression of a woman who had spent the day answering questions she could no longer avoid. I entered through a side door at 8:12. I had changed out of my wet clothes at Mara's office. She found me a plain gray suit and insisted I dry my hair before we left. Even so, exhaustion had settled into my bones after the rescue. For once, I did not need to pretend weakness. I used Caroline's old walking stick, the one she carried during her final months. The polished wooden handle fit my palm. Every slow step drew Julian's attention without making me appear confrontational. He crossed the room to greet me. "Maggie," he said softly, "I wasn't certain you would come." I nearly didn't. His eyes searched my face. He was looking for panic, accusation, or proof that I knew what had happened to the tug. I gave him fatigue. "The harbor traffic was difficult," I said. "The weather has caused several delays. Was the Caroline K one of them?" A faint pause. "The trial was postponed," he lied without blinking. "And Harper?" "With friends, I believe. Allison has been trying to reach her." Behind him, Allison stood beside the signing table, checking her phone again and again. Her face looked colorless beneath the lights. Julian touched my arm. "Tonight needs to remain focused on the future. Allison is already under enormous pressure. I have no intention of making a scene. I know." He smiled because he believed me. Mara and Dana entered separately. Mara carried a leather portfolio and joined the transaction attorneys. Dana wore a dark dress and introduced herself to no one, blending among the insurance representatives near the back. Franklin Moss stood beside her. The remote relay had already been sealed in Atlantic Mutual's evidence facility. Captain Webb and both mechanics were giving statements to the Coast Guard. Thomas had been moved to a secure location. Harper was safe at Mara's office with an investigator. Julian knew none of it. He believed the Caroline K was either disabled beyond recovery or sitting somewhere in darkness with its evidence beneath the water. He believed the missing pump data had been erased. He believed Thomas had been removed before he could interfere. Most of all, he believed I had arrived too tired to fight. A young Blue Heron executive approached and introduced himself as Graham Pike, nephew of the attorney who had structured Julian's hidden investment. "We are honored to protect what you built," he said. I looked toward the miniature towers. How much of it will remain? the spirit. That was the language of people preparing to demolish something. They preserved the spirit because it required no square footage. At 8:25, Julian called everyone to order. He stood beneath a banner reading a new chapter for Annapolis Waterfront. "Tonight is about courage," he began. "The courage to accept change before change is forced upon us." He described the insurance crisis, tightening credit, aging infrastructure, and redevelopment pressure. He mentioned none of the substituted parts, false records, or vendor payments routed into his own company. He praised Allison for making difficult decisions. Then he praised me. "Margaret Keene built this yard through discipline, sacrifice, and an uncompromising commitment to safety. Her willingness to support this transition demonstrates the same leadership tonight." Applause filled the room. I sat at the far end of the front row, separated from the signing table by Blue Heron executives, bankers, and attorneys. My chair had been placed slightly behind theirs, the weakest seat in the room. That was exactly where I needed to be. Julian invited Allison to speak. She approached the microphone holding prepared remarks, but her hands trembled against the paper. "My mother and my aunt believed a business should serve the people who depend on it," she began. Her phone vibrated on the podium. She looked down. Julian stepped closer and quietly turned the screen face down. Allison lost her place. The silence stretched. Then she folded the speech. "I know some of you believe we are giving up," she said. "I believe that too, but we cannot protect a legacy by refusing to see when it is in danger." She looked at me. For one moment, I thought she might ask about Harper. Instead, she finished the sentence Julian needed. "I support the agreement." Some employees applauded. Thomas's crew did not. Ruth approached the microphone next. She announced that the employee trust would not cast its final vote until it reviewed the complete transaction disclosures. Julian's jaw tightened, though he disguised it by adjusting the papers before him. Blue Heron still had Allison's 40%. They needed the employee trust's 15 to reach the required 55. Julian believed the disclosures would deliver it. Graham Pike explained that the papers being signed that evening did not complete the sale. They locked the financial terms, confirmed management's representations, and allowed Blue Heron to begin final closing work. His description was meant to sound harmless. Mara had ensured it was not. Each management signatory had to certify that no material information had been concealed and no related party interest existed between the company's decision-makers, vendors, and buyer. The documents also confirmed that there were no unreported safety events likely to produce a major insurance claim. The Caroline K had nearly sunk less than 2 hours earlier. Julian called Allison to the table. First, she opened the leather folder. I watched her eyes move across the plain language disclosure Mara had drafted. No undisclosed ownership interest in any paid vendor. No financial participation in Blue Heron. No falsification or removal of material safety records. Her pen stopped above the paper. Julian bent close and whispered something. Allison looked at him. Then she signed. The room applauded again. Julian sat next. He signed the letter of intent, the record accuracy certification, and the no-conflict disclosure, without reading them twice. Finally, Graham placed the seller's certificate in front of him. "By signing this," he said for the cameras, "you confirm that management has disclosed every material event affecting the company through this evening." Julian looked directly toward me. He wanted me to see him inherit my authority. Then he lowered the pen and wrote his full name. The final stroke had barely left the page when the doors behind the reporters opened. The doors behind the reporters opened, and Harper walked into the sail loft. Her hair was still damp. A narrow bandage crossed her forehead where she had struck the engine room ladder. Captain Webb followed beside her, wearing a borrowed jacket over his wet uniform. Behind them came 2 Coast Guard investigators and an Atlantic Mutual Evidence officer carrying a sealed black case. The room fell silent. Allison stood so quickly that her chair overturned. "Harper?" She pushed past Julian and crossed the room. Harper allowed her mother to hold her for only a moment before stepping back. "You told her the trial was canceled," Harper said. Allison turned toward Julian. He did not answer immediately. His pen remained beside the seller's certificate bearing his fresh signature. "There was a communications problem," he said at last. "The vessel experienced a minor mechanical issue, and the crew returned safely. Captain Webb stared at him, minor. Julian's gaze moved to the Coast Guard officers. This is a private corporate event. Unless someone has a warrant, no one is searching the premises, Mara said. She approached the signing table and placed one hand on the leather folder Julian had just signed. We are documenting a material event you certified did not exist. Graham Pike looked down at the seller's certificate. What event? Julian stood. A pump malfunction during a routine trial. It has no bearing on the transaction. Dana Cho stepped out from the group near the rear wall. The Caroline K lost both primary bilge pumps, navigation data, automatic identification transmission, and part of its steering response, while taking water through the port sea chest compartment. The room changed. Reporters lifted cameras. Blue Heron's attorneys leaned toward one another. The bank representative closed the folder in front of him. Dana continued. The tug developed a severe port list and came within minutes of grounding near Greenberry Point. 4 people were aboard. Allison looked at Harper again. You were on that boat? I was told it would remain dockside. Julian raised his voice. We do not know what caused the failure. An aging tug suffered an equipment problem. That is precisely why the yard needs investment. Mara tapped the certificate. You signed a statement confirming there were no unreported safety events through this evening. I was not informed of any material incident before signing. Harper stared at him. I called your office from the engine room. Julian's expression did not move. My staff receives hundreds of calls, you answered. A murmur spread through the employees. Harper took one step closer to the table. I told you the pumps were dropping out. You said the alarm was probably a bad sensor and ordered Captain Webb to continue the trial. Captain Webb nodded. I heard the call. Julian turned toward him. You were responsible for the vessel. If you believed it was unsafe, you had authority to return. The steering began failing less than 5 minutes after your instruction. Then perhaps your crew did not maintain the tug properly. There it was. His first defense was not denial, it was selection. He began choosing the people who would carry his blame. Dana signaled to the evidence officer. The man placed the sealed black case on the signing table and opened its exterior cover without breaking the evidence seal. Inside was the unmarked remote relay recovered from the Caroline K's pump control circuit. Dana displayed photographs taken before its removal. This device was wired behind the original junction panel, she said. It was not part of the tug's approved electrical plan. When activated, it interrupted the control signal to both bilge pumps. Julian looked at the images. I have never seen it. The housing carries a lot number purchased by East Channel Marine Logistics. I do not manage every vendor component. No, I said from my chair. You only own the vendor. Every head turned toward me. I rose slowly, keeping Caroline's walking stick in one hand. The room seemed larger than it had minutes earlier. Julian remained behind the signing table, beneath his banner about courage and change. I walked toward the projection screen. Mara handed the audiovisual technician a prepared drive. The development rendering disappeared. The first image showed the security footage Julian had used to remove me. The woman in my coat stood beside the Celestine service bay. The timestamp glowed in the corner, 9:15 p.m. I asked the technician to advance. A tide chart appeared beside the frame, followed by a photograph of the seawall measurement stripe. At 9:15 that night, I said, the tide was more than 2 feet below the 3rd stripe. In this video, the water reaches the 5th. I pointed toward the reflection behind the disguised figure. The light comes from the east. This footage was recorded after sunrise, not at night. Someone altered the timestamp before presenting it as evidence. Julian gave a small, contemptuous smile. You are basing an accusation on reflected light? No, I am beginning with it. The screen changed again. Franklin Moss entered the room carrying 2 transparent evidence containers. He placed them side by side beneath the lights. In the first rested the yellow brass valve recovered from the Celestine after its failure. In the second was the darker silicon bronze valve Tomas had saved. My inspection mark is on the original, I said. The approved valve was removed after I certified it. A cheaper rejected model was installed in its place. Julian's eyes moved toward Tomas's empty position among the workers. Tomas Alvarez controlled maintenance and evidence disposal. He signed the disposal form, I said. He did not destroy the component. The technician displayed the weighbridge logs. East Channel's truck entered the yard after midnight and left 7 pounds heavier. My disabled badge opened warehouse 13 minutes before the disposal record was created. Then came the 6 invoices, $186,000, all approved through Allison's executive credential. All paid to East Channel Marine Logistics. Mara placed the beneficial ownership report beside Julian's signed disclosure. East Channel is controlled through Armitage Coastal Holdings, she said. Armitage is held for the benefit of Julian Reed. Graham Pike's face had gone rigid. You certified that you had no undisclosed related party vendor interest. Julian did not look at him. The structure was established for investment efficiency. East Channel performed legitimate emergency services. Then why hide your ownership? Ruth asked. Because Maggie has spent weeks poisoning this company against me. He pointed toward the original valve. She coordinated with Tomas. She manipulated her granddaughter. She interfered with an active sea trial and manufactured a spectacle to stop a sale the employees need. His voice had lost its polish, not entirely, but the first crack had opened. He turned toward Allison. Tell them, you reviewed the invoices, you approved every payment. You know these services were legitimate. Allison stood beside her overturned chair, staring at the documents on the screen. Julian reached for her hand. She pulled it away. For several seconds, she looked neither at him nor at me. Then she stepped toward the microphone. He is right about one thing, she said. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the entire room. I authorized the first payment. The recording ended. For several seconds, no one in the sail loft moved. Julian's own voice remained in the silence after the speakers went dead. Make sure the Caroline K doesn't come back. He looked toward the doors, then toward the 2 Coast Guard investigators standing beside Harper. I watched him calculate distance, witnesses, and possible exits. That was the last moment he possessed any control. One investigator stepped forward. Mr. Reed, we need you to remain available for questioning regarding the operation of the Caroline K. Julian recovered enough to smile. I am happy to cooperate through counsel. You are free to contact an attorney. He looked toward Calder Pike. The lawyer who had structured his companies was already gathering his papers. Calder? Pike did not meet his eyes. I represent Blue Heron in this transaction, he said. Not you personally. Julian turned to Allison. She stood beside Harper with her arms at her sides. No hand reached for him. No one made a dramatic arrest that night. There were no sirens inside the sail loft and no handcuffs beneath the cameras. Real consequences arrived more slowly. They also lasted longer. Atlantic Mutual suspended every active claim connected to East Channel and appointed independent examiners to review 3 years of repairs. The Coast Guard issued preservation orders covering the Caroline K, server systems, maintenance records, and Julian's electronic devices. The bank froze the proposed sale and restricted the company's revolving credit line until emergency governance could be established. By midnight, Blue Heron had withdrawn from the transaction. By morning, photographs from the gala appeared across local news sites. Julian stood beneath his banner about courage, while the headline beneath him referred to suspected sabotage and undisclosed financial interests. The image followed him longer than any criminal charge. Mara called an emergency shareholder meeting 2 days later. Allison attended with her own attorney. Julian did not appear. His lawyer delivered a letter claiming that he had been removed from management without due process and that all allegations resulted from a campaign led by a hostile, cognitively impaired founder. He was still trying to use my age after everything else had failed. Mara read the sentence aloud, then set the letter aside. The board voted unanimously to terminate Julian's consulting authority and revoke every company credential connected to him or East Channel. Allison's resignation as chief financial officer was accepted. She did not argue. Her 40% ownership remained intact, but voting rights connected to daily management were temporarily placed under an independent fiduciary agreement while investigators reviewed the payments made under her account. I could have attempted to seize control. With Julian removed and Allison unable to exercise operational authority, everyone expected me to return to the head of the table. I did not. Instead, I asked Ruth Ellison to serve as interim chair and appointed a three-person operating committee consisting of Ruth, an outside Marine executive, and a representative elected by the employees. The room reacted as though I had announced I was selling the harbor. "Maggie," Peter Vance said, "the company needs you. The company needs controls that do not depend on one person." For 41 years, I had believed my vigilance protected Keene Harbor Works. In many ways, it had also created a business where too much knowledge, authority, and history remained inside my head. When I stepped back, Julian filled the empty space faster than anyone knew how to stop him. I had built a strong hull around a single point of failure. That failure was me. The employee trust received an additional 10% ownership interest from my shares, raising its stake to 25%. I retained 35, Allison retained 40, though her voting restrictions remained in place. The transfer cost me money. It cost me something more important as well. It meant that I could never again decide the yard's future alone. Atlantic Mutual extended temporary coverage after the new operating controls were adopted. The carrier did not trust us yet, but it trusted independent oversight, sealed evidence procedures, and a management team no longer connected to Julian. Payroll continued. No employee missed a check. Tomas returned as foreman after giving a complete statement. He received a written reprimand for signing the false disposal authorization, and he accepted it without complaint. "I should have come to you sooner," he told me. "I made it difficult for people to bring me bad news. You would have listened. I would have taken over." He considered that and nodded. Both things were true. The federal investigation expanded over the next 4 months. Bank records showed that East Channel had purchased rejected components through liquidation suppliers, billed Keene Harbor Works for premium marine-grade equipment, and resold the original parts through brokers in 3 states. Julian's development participation in Blue Heron was valued at more than $8 million if the waterfront project had proceeded. Forensic examination of his tablet connected it to the remote command sent to the Caroline K's relay. Investigators also recovered drafts discussing how a total loss claim could provide transition liquidity before the property sale. He was charged with wire fraud, insurance fraud, falsification of business records, conspiracy, and offenses related to knowingly endangering the people aboard the tug. His assets were restrained pending restitution claims. The consulting company that once displayed his photograph above the words "Strategic Waterfront Leadership" closed within weeks. Calder Pike faced a separate professional investigation. Blue Heron denied knowing Julian had planned sabotage, but the firm abandoned its Annapolis expansion and settled claims connected to its incomplete disclosures. Allison cooperated fully. That did not make her innocent. She admitted approving the first East Channel invoice without proper verification, allowing Julian access to her credentials, and withholding the side agreement after she discovered it. No criminal charge was filed against her, but she entered a civil settlement with the company. She surrendered 2 years of distributions, contributed personal funds toward the insurance deductible, and agreed not to hold a financial or managerial position at the yard for at least 5 years. I saw her twice during those months. Both meetings occurred in lawyers' offices. She did not call me Aunt Maggie. I did not call her the girl I raised. We spoke about documents, dates, and restitution. Nothing more. Harper visited me every Sunday, but she refused to carry messages between us. "You both taught me not to hide damage," she said. "I'm not going to cover this crack with paint." The Caroline K spent 5 months in our largest repair bay. Crews replaced damaged wiring, rebuilt the pump controls, and inspected every section Julian's people had touched. The tug survived. Our family had not yet done the same. On the morning the repaired engines passed their final dock test, I found an envelope beneath my office door. Allison's handwriting appeared on the front. Inside was a single page. She did not ask for forgiveness, money, ownership, or her old position. She wrote that she understood why I could not trust her. She said she was learning to live without Julian's explanations and without expecting me to repair every consequence. Then, at the bottom, she asked one question. When the Caroline K was launched again, could she stand on the dock? 1 year after Julian signed his name beneath a lie, the Caroline K waited at the edge of the launch basin. Fresh gold lettering curved across her stern. Her hull wore the same deep blue Caroline had chosen when we bought the tug from a bankrupt oyster company in 1987. The new paint did not erase every scar, and I had not asked the crew to try. A repaired vessel should be safe. It did not need to pretend it had never been damaged. Keene Harbor Works had changed as well. The employee trust now owned 25% of the company and held 2 permanent board seats. Ruth Ellison remained chair. Our new chief financial officer had no family connection to any shareholder, and every large payment required independent approval. I served as chair emerita. I attended 1 board meeting each month, reviewed major safety reports, and kept my hands away from daily decisions unless someone asked for them. That last part had taken practice. For most of my life, I entered a room already searching for the mistake. I believed responsibility meant noticing everything before anyone else did. Now I was learning that leadership could also mean allowing another person to notice first. Harper had graduated in May and returned as a junior marine engineer. Not my assistant, not my replacement. She reported to the engineering director and received the same probationary review as every other new employee. She complained for 3 days, then she became proud of it. That morning, she stood beside the tide board in steel-toed boots and a yellow hard hat. She had calculated the launch window using tide, wind set, tug displacement, and winter sediment. I had performed the same calculation privately. Her answer differed from mine by 7 minutes. A year earlier, I would have assumed she was wrong. That morning I asked why. The northeast wind eased after 6, she said. The station update changed the set. She showed me the reading. She was right. I closed my notebook before she saw my original time. Employees and their families filled the dock. Captain Webb stood on the bridge. Tomas waited near the travel lift controls, arguing with a younger mechanic about a line that was already secure. Some things did not need to change. Julian's criminal case had moved through federal court during the winter. Faced with the relay data, financial transfers, recorded statement, and Allison's emails, he pleaded guilty to wire fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. His consulting company was gone. His Blue Heron participation was worthless. Money recovered from restrained accounts went toward restitution and repairs. It did not restore trust. Money rarely repairs the thing people imagine it will. Allison completed her civil settlement and began working for a nonprofit that taught financial literacy to women leaving controlling relationships. I learned that from Harper, we had exchanged 3 letters during the year. None contained the word forgiveness. That morning, Allison arrived alone. She stopped at the dock entrance as though an invisible gate remained between her and the rest of us. She wore a dark coat and carried nothing. Harper saw her first. For a moment, my grandniece looked at me, asking without words whether I would allow the day to become complicated. I nodded. Harper crossed the dock and embraced her mother. When they separated, Allison found an open place near the seawall and stood quietly. I joined her before the ceremony. "Thank you for letting me come," she said. "You asked to stand on the dock. I wasn't sure that meant beside you. It does not mean everything is repaired. I know." The old Allison would have rushed to explain until her apology asked me to comfort her. This Allison waited. "I blamed Julian for teaching me to doubt myself," she said. "He did, but I also used him to avoid decisions I was afraid to make. I looked toward the tug. I solved every consequence before it reached you. You thought you were protecting me. I was also protecting myself from watching you fail." She accepted that without arguing. "I don't expect my position back. It is not available. I know. I don't know when your voting rights should be restored. I understand, and I cannot promise we will become what we were." Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "What we were allowed this to happen." That was the most honest thing either of us had said. I touched her sleeve. "We can become something else. Not forgiveness, not yet. But a beginning did not need to pretend it was a destination." Ruth called everyone toward the launch platform. I took my place beside the employees rather than at the microphone. Harper approached with the final release form. "Wind is still dropping," she said. "I recommend we wait 4 more minutes." Thomas glanced at the clock. "The basin is ready now." Harper held her ground. "The water will give us cleaner stern clearance at 10:23. Everyone looked at me. For decades, the decision would have been mine. I studied the tide board. The painted stripes climbed above the water, the same kind of marks that had exposed Julian's false video. Back then, the tide had told me someone was lying. Now it was telling Harper when to move. "You are the engineer on record," I said. "Your call." She waited 4 minutes. At 10:23, the restraints released. The Caroline K moved down the rails, entered the basin, and settled into the water with one deep, steady roll. Her pumps held, her engines answered. The crowd applauded as Captain Webb sounded the horn. Allison stood beside me, crying without hiding it. I took her hand, not because the past had disappeared, but because it had not. The Caroline K turned toward open water. Harper watched every gauge while Tomas complained that young engineers trusted tablets too much. I smiled. For years I believed a legacy was something you defended by keeping control of it. I know better now. A legacy is not a building or a vessel that never takes damage. It is what remains useful after the damage is repaired. Water remembers pressure, families do too, but both can carry you forward when you stop demanding that the cracks never existed. If this story stayed with you, share where you are listening from, and remember that silence is not surrender when it gives you time to see the truth clearly.